I don't believe it.
We've been trying to calm these dogs for weeks.
Concrete holds heat long after the sun goes down. Edmund felt it seeping through the soles of his boots, mixing with the sharp, metallic tang of dried blood and industrial bleach. 6 cages, 6 ruined dogs. Everyone else saw a lost cause, but Edmund just saw ghosts. Gravel crunched under the heavy, uneven tread of Edmund's boots as he hauled the last 50-pound sack of winter feed out of his flatbed. His lower back gave a familiar, sickening pop. He ignored it. He was 71, and ignoring physical degradation was the only religion he had left. He dumped the sack onto the wooden pallet, dusting his calloused hands on the thighs of his Carhartts. The fabric was stiff with dirt, old grease, and a faint, lingering smell of sweet feed. He didn't like coming to Fort Campbell. The base was too clean, too sharp, too full of young men in pressed uniforms pretending they understood how the world worked. Edmund only took the government contract to supply the base's equine therapy unit because the property taxes on his farm were threatening to drown him. He signed the electronic tablet. A young private thrust at him, his thick, scarred fingers clumsy against the smooth glass. The kid didn't look at him. Nobody looked at old men in dirty jackets. Edmund turned to get back into his truck, desperate for the smell of stale coffee and the rattling hum of his worn-out transmission. Then he heard it. It wasn't a bark. Barks were what farm dogs did when a coyote got too close to the property line. Barks had purpose. This noise was a jagged, tearing sound. It was a frantic clatter of teeth against heavy-gauge steel, accompanied by a low, vibrating hum that sat right at the base of the skull. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Edmund stopped with his hand on the rusted handle of his Dodge door. His knuckles were white. A cold sweat prickled at his hairline, right where the faded green cap met his forehead. The sound dug into his ears, bypassing the decades of civilian life and hooking directly into a nerve he thought he had killed somewhere in the Iadrang Valley. "Get in the truck, old man. Not your farm, not your livestock." He pulled the door handle. The hinges squeaked. A sharp yelp cut through the air, a sound of pain, quickly swallowed by a guttural, wet snarl. Edmund let go of the door. He cursed under his breath, a raspy, quiet string of profanities, and turned his back on his truck. He walked toward the sound, his left knee clicking with every second step. The kennel complex sat behind a secondary chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. It was a concrete bunker of a building designed for efficiency, not comfort. As Edmund rounded the corner, the noise hit him like a physical blow. The air smelled foul here. It wasn't just the sharp chemical burn of military-grade disinfectant. It was the dense, sour musk of cortisol, hot breath, and urine. It was the smell of terror. 6 outdoor runs jutted out from the main building. Inside them were 6 Belgian Malinois. They didn't look like the sleek, disciplined missiles Edmund occasionally saw patrolling the gates. They looked like ragged coyotes. In front of the cages, a chaotic scene was unfolding. 3 handlers, young, their faces flushed red with frustration and fear, were shouting over each other. One of them, a thick-necked sergeant, was holding a heavy aluminum catchpole, the wire loop at the end trembling. He was wearing thick Kevlar bite sleeves that went all the way up to his shoulders. "Get the snare over his head, Walker. Just get it over his head," another handler yelled, holding a clipboard like a shield. "He won't stop spinning, sir. If I hook him now, he'll snap his own damn neck," Walker shouted back, sweat dripping off his nose. Edmund stopped 10 feet away, leaning heavily against a concrete barrier. He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his breast pocket, put one between his lips, and just watched. He didn't light it. In run 1, a large, dark-faced Malinois was throwing his entire body weight against the chain link, bouncing off and hitting it again. Blood smeared the wire where he had split his muzzle. Run 2 held a lighter-colored dog that was just spinning in tight, obsessive circles, saliva flying from its jaws in thick ropes. Run 3 was worse. The dog was completely still, pressed into the farthest corner, its eyes wide and dilated until no brown showed, teeth bared in a silent, vibrating rictus. "These are the retirees?" Edmund asked. His voice was gravelly, quiet, but it cut through the shouting. The handler with the clipboard spun around, startled. "Hey, this is a restricted area, Pops. You need to get back to the loading dock." "I asked a question," Edmund said, rolling the unlit cigarette from one side of his mouth to the other. "These the ones coming back from deployment?" "Yeah, SOTF drop-offs. Now back away. They're slated for euthanasia at 1,400 hours. They're unstable. We can't even get them out of the runs to put them down." The lieutenant's voice shook. He was trying to sound authoritative, but Edmund could smell the kid's fear rolling off him in waves. The dogs could smell it too. The young soldiers were broadcasting anxiety, feeding it directly into the cages. Every time Walker twitched the catch pole, the dog and Run 1 hit the fence harder. "You're making it worse," Edmund said. He pushed off the concrete barrier. "Sir, I'm ordering you to leave the perimeter," the lieutenant barked, stepping into Edmund's path. Edmund looked at the young man. He didn't puff out his chest. He didn't square his shoulders. He just let his eyes drop, going flat and dead, staring straight through the lieutenant's face. It was the look of a man who had scraped friends off the floor of a Huey, a man who knew exactly how cheap life was. The lieutenant swallowed hard and involuntarily took a half step back. "You're going to break that dog's neck with that wire," Edmund said, his tone conversational, empty of any threat. "And if you do, he's going to die thrashing, and you're going to hear that sound in your sleep for the next 40 years. Put the pole down." "I can't do that, sir. We have our orders," Walker said, still holding the pole, his arms shaking from the adrenaline. "Son," Edmund said, shifting his gaze to the thick-necked sergeant, "you're wearing 70 pounds of protective gear, and you're sweating like a pig in a slaughterhouse. That dog knows you think he's a monster, so he's giving you a monster." Edmund didn't wait for a response. He walked slowly past the lieutenant, his boots scuffing the concrete. He didn't walk straight toward the cages. He walked parallel to them, his posture slumped, his shoulders rounded. He made himself small. He made himself boring. The noise in the pens reached a fever pitch as he moved. The dog in Run 1, the fence basher, stopped throwing himself at the wire and lunged at the front gate, snapping his jaws inches from Edmund's face. The clack of teeth sounded like 2 billiard balls smashing together. Edmund didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stopped walking. He didn't turn to face the dog. He kept his body angled away, a sign of total disinterest in the K9 language. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered Zippo. Clink. The sound of the metal lid opening was impossibly sharp in the heavy air. He sparked the flint. A flame flared. He lit the cigarette, took a slow, deep drag, and let the acrid blue smoke drift from his nostrils. The smell of cheap tobacco cut through the heavy odor of bleach and panic. It was a grounding scent. Earthy, dirty, human. "Hey," Edmund grunted. He wasn't talking to the handlers. He wasn't really talking to the dog either. It was just a sound, a low, gravelly vibration in his chest. He slowly lowered himself until he was sitting on the raw concrete, cross-legged, about 3 feet from the gate of Run 1. His knees protested violently, a sharp spike of arthritis shooting up his thighs, but his face remained a mask of bored indifference. He leaned his back against a metal post, smoked his cigarette, and looked out toward the base parking lot. "What is he doing?" Walker whispered loudly to the lieutenant. "Shut up," Edmund said, without looking at them. "Stop vibrating. Put the damn pole on the ground and step back." Hesitantly, Walker lowered the catch pole. It clattered against the concrete. The sudden absence of the metal loop waving in the air changed the geometry of the space. The dog in run one, a massive beast with a scar tearing through his left ear, stood on his hind legs. His front paws hooked into the chain link above Edmund's head. He was panting heavily, his hot breath raining down on Edmund's worn cap. He growled a deep, chest-rattling sound that warned of imminent violence. Edmund took another drag of his cigarette. He didn't look up. He just sat there, breathing slowly. In, out. He slowed his own heart rate. He let the tension bleed out of his shoulders. He thought about the soil on his farm after a spring rain. He thought about the quiet ticking of his tractor engine cooling down. He projected a bubble of absolute, impenetrable apathy. He knew these dogs. Not literally, but he knew what lived inside their heads. The military took high-drive animals, wired them to a hair trigger, trained them to anticipate explosions, gunfire, and human aggression, and then threw them into hell. When their nervous systems finally burned out, when they couldn't turn off the switch anymore, they were deemed unpredictable. They weren't unpredictable. They were just stuck in the war. Edmund had been stuck there too. Still was, some nights. 3 minutes passed. The handler stood frozen, watching the crazy old farmer smoking on the ground. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the rhythm of the kennel began to shift. The spinning dog in run 2 stumbled, broke his tight circle, and stood panting, his head hanging low. The dog in run 3 stopped his silent vibrating and let out a long, shuddering sigh. Above Edmund, the massive dog in run 1 pushed off the fence. He dropped to all fours. The growl faded into a rough, jagged panting. He paced back and forth across the front of the gate twice, his yellow eyes darting down to the old man sitting in the dirt. Edmund didn't return the eye contact. Looking a broken dog in the eye was a challenge, a demand. Edmund demanded nothing. The dog stopped in front of the gate. He lowered his heavy, scarred head, sniffing the air. He smelled the tobacco. He smelled the turned earth and sweet feed embedded in Edmund's clothes. Most importantly, he smelled the old man's sweat. There was no adrenaline in it, no fear, no anger. Just a bone-deep exhaustion. The dog let out a sharp huff of air through his nose. He circled once, twice, and then, with a heavy thud, collapsed onto the concrete just on the other side of the chain link from Edmund. He didn't lie on his side. He lay in a sphinx position, paws tucked under his chest, eyes fixed on the side of Edmund's face. Edmund took one last drag of his cigarette and stubbed it out on the heel of his boot. He didn't speak. He just slowly lifted his right hand, heavily scarred from a farming accident decades ago, and pressed the back of his knuckles against the chain link wire. He didn't push his fingers through. He just rested them against the cold steel. The Malinois stared at the hand. A low rumble started in his throat again, but it sounded different now, less like a threat, more like a question. The dog shifted his weight. He extended his neck, millimeters at a time, until the wet leather of his black nose brushed the wire directly opposite Edmund's knuckles. A collective breath hitched in the throats of the handlers behind him. The dog closed his eyes, let out a long, whistling breath, and rested his chin on his paws, keeping his nose pressed against the metal wire, inches from Edmund's skin. The kennel was completely silent. The manic energy had shattered, replaced by a heavy, fragile stillness. Edmund turned his head, just slightly, finally looking at the young lieutenant over his shoulder. The kid was pale, staring at the dogs as if he had just watched water flow uphill. "They don't need putting down, Lieutenant," Edmund said quietly, his voice dry as cracked earth. They just need somebody to tell him the war's over. Leather creaked as Edmund pulled his worn work gloves from his back pocket. He didn't put them on, he just held them, working the stiff, sweat-stained cowhide between his thumbs. "I need 6 slip leads," Edmund said to the concrete wall opposite the pens. "Nylon, if that's all you got, but leather, if you have it. Nylon burns when they pull." Lieutenant Jace finally found his voice. It cracked on the first syllable. "Sir, you can't take military property. These animals are classified as hazardous material at this stage. The paperwork, alone." Edmund slowly pushed himself up from the concrete. His left knee popped loudly, a dry, snapping sound that made the dog in run one twitch. Edmund swayed for a fraction of a second, letting a wave of dizziness pass, before steadying himself against the chain link. He turned to Jace. "They ain't property, Lieutenant," Edmund said, his voice dropping into a low, harsh rasp. "They're veterans, and right now, your paperwork is a death warrant. You want to euthanize 6 combat dogs who survived Helmand Province because you don't know how to turn off the alarm bell in their heads? Go ahead, call the MP. Tell them an old man is stealing your trash." Jace looked at Walker. Walker looked at the dirt. Nobody moved toward a radio. They were terrified of the dogs. But Edmund realized they were also deeply, profoundly ashamed. They didn't want to kill these animals. They just didn't know how to save them. "Get the leads, Walker," Jace muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. His face was pale beneath his buzz cut. "There's a box of heavy-duty cotton roping in the shed." 5 minutes later, Edmund stood before the gate of Run 1. A thick, braided cotton rope hung loosely in his scarred right hand. He didn't ask for the catch-pole. He didn't ask for the Kevlar sleeves. "Unlock it," Edmund said. Jace stepped forward, his hand trembling as he keyed the heavy brass padlock. The mechanism clicked. It sounded like a gunshot in the tense air. Jace practically sprinted backward the moment the lock fell away. Edmund didn't pull the door open. He unlatched it and pushed it inward, just an inch. The massive Malinois was on his feet instantly. The brief moment of calm had vanished the second the hardware rattled. The dog shoved his wedge-shaped head into the gap, his shoulder slamming against the steel gate. He was snarling again, a wet, guttural noise that sprayed saliva across the front of Edmund's faded jacket. The dog's teeth were yellowed. One of the K9s chipped half off. This was the test. Edmund knew it. The handlers had always fought back. They pulled, they shouted, they choked. Edmund did nothing. He didn't push against the gate. He didn't pull it open. He just held his ground, letting the heavy steel door rest against the dog's surging shoulder. "You're making a lot of noise, son," Edmund murmured softly, looking past the dog's ear, focusing on a crack in the cinder block wall behind the pen. The dog snapped, his jaws clamping down on the heavy canvas of Edmund's left sleeve. He didn't hit flesh, just a mouthful of Carhartt and empty air, but he pulled backward violently, trying to drag Edmund off balance. The fabric ripped. Edmund felt the jolt tear through his bad shoulder. A white-hot spike of pain nested in his rotator cuff. He gritted his teeth, swallowing a groan. He stepped into the pull. Instead of resisting, he moved his body forward, giving the dog slack. The sudden loss of tension confused the Malinois. He let go of the fabric, stumbling backward a half step, his brow furrowed. He let out a low, confused huff. Edmund didn't hesitate. He didn't make a big, sweeping gesture. With a slow, fluid motion, born of 40 years handling half-wild colts, he slipped the loop of the cotton rope over the dog's scarred head. He didn't pull it tight. He let it drape loosely around the thick, muscular neck. The dog froze. The sensation of the leash usually meant a fight. He waited for the choke. He waited for the drag. Edmund turned his back on the dog and started walking toward the parking lot. He didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't issue a command. He just kept the leash loose in his hand, letting it trail behind him. For 3 agonizing seconds, the rope stayed slack. Then, the tension caught. Edmund stopped. He didn't pull. He just stood still, a heavy anchor in the dirt. Behind him, the dog took a hesitant step out of the cage. His claws clicked against the concrete. He was panting fast, his head darting left and right, scanning the open space for threats. But the leash wasn't fighting him. The old man wasn't fighting him. Edmund took another step. The dog followed. It took 45 minutes to get all 6 dogs out. Edmund's body felt like it had been beaten with a tire iron. His hands were cramping so badly they were locked into claws. The 3rd dog, the one that had been pressed into the corner, had evacuated its bowels in pure terror the moment Edmund touched it, leaving Edmund's boots stinking of sick animal. The 5th dog had flat out refused to walk, forcing Edmund to sit in the dirt for 20 minutes until the animal's heart rate slowed enough to coax it forward. He loaded them into the custom livestock crate in the bed of his Dodge. It was partitioned with heavy steel mesh designed for transporting unruly boars. It wasn't pretty, but it was secure. As Edmund slammed the heavy tailgate shut, engaging the locking pins, Jace walked up. The lieutenant held a thick manila folder. "Their medical files," Jace said quietly, "and their deployment records. For what it's worth." Edmund took the folder. It felt heavy, too heavy. "They're officially listed as transferred to an off-site civilian rehabilitation facility," Jace added, avoiding Edmund's eyes. "Nobody's going to come looking for them. But nobody's going to send you a check for their feed either." "I didn't ask for a check," Edmund rasped. He tossed the folder through the open window of his cab. It landed on the passenger seat, scattering loose paperwork across the cracked vinyl. He climbed into the driver's seat. The engine turned over with a protesting whine before catching, settling into a rough diesel idle. Edmund didn't wave goodbye. He put the truck in gear and drove toward the gate, leaving the sterile concrete bunkers behind. Dusk was settling over the Tennessee hills by the time Edmund's truck rattled up the long, rutted dirt driveway of his farm. The air was different out here. It was heavy with moisture, carrying the scent of rotting oak leaves, damp earth, and the sweet, fermenting smell of old hay from the barn. Edmund killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the ticking of the cooling manifold and the shrill chirping of crickets in the tall grass. From the bed of the truck, there was no sound, no barking, no whining, just the low, synchronized rhythm of 6 heavy animals breathing. Edmund sat in the cab for a long time. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel. He was exhausted down to the marrow of his bones. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and his wallet was thin enough to fold twice over. He looked at the scattering of military files on the passenger seat. SOTF, Kandahar, Fallujah, clearances, explosive detections, confirmed kills. He swept the papers off the seat onto the floorboard with a single rough motion. "Stupid old man," he muttered to the empty cab. He grabbed his heavy flashlight and stepped out into the twilight. He walked to the back of the truck and lowered the tailgate. He had 6 empty folding stalls in the main barn. They were massive, 12 by 12-foot squares, enclosed by thick oak planks and heavy iron grates, bedded deep with fresh pine shavings. It took him another hour to move the dogs. He did it the same way he had at the base, slow, silent, projecting absolute boredom. He filled heavy rubber buckets with fresh well water and dumped a scoop of high-protein kibble into 6 metal bowls. When the last stall door slid shut and the latch dropped into place, Edmund didn't leave the barn. He dragged a battered aluminum folding chair into the center aisle, placed it directly under a flickering yellow incandescent bulb, and sat down. He pulled a thermos from his coat pocket, unscrewed the cap, and took a long swallow of lukewarm black coffee. It tasted like tin and old grounds. It tasted perfect. He looked down the aisle. 6 sets of eyes watched him from the shadows of the stalls. They weren't pacing anymore. They weren't throwing themselves against the wood. The smell of the barn, the dust, the horse sweat, the pine was sensory overload, but it was natural. It wasn't chemical. In the stall nearest to him was the big, scarred dog from Run 1. The animal was standing stiffly by the heavy wooden door, his nose pressed against the crack between the planks. Edmund sighed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his knife, and cut off a small piece of dried beef jerky he kept for himself. He tossed it under the gap of the stall door. The dog flinched away from the sudden movement. A low growl rumbled in the shadows. Edmund ignored it. He leaned back in his aluminum chair, the metal creaking under his weight. He stretched his bad leg out in front of him, resting his heel on the dirt floor. "You don't have to eat it," Edmund said to the dark barn. His voice was a quiet gravel in the vast wooden space. "You don't have to do a damn thing. Nobody's asking you to find a bomb. Nobody's asking you to bite a man. You're just taking up space and breathing my air." The dog in the stall stood perfectly still. 5 minutes passed. The only sound was the wind rattling the loose tin on the barn roof. Slowly, a heavy paw stepped forward into the dim light spilling under the door. Then a black nose sniffed the dirt. The piece of jerky vanished with a quiet snap of jaws. Edmund didn't smile. He didn't feel a warm, fuzzy glow in his chest. He just felt tired. He knew this wasn't a cure. Tomorrow, a tractor backfiring might send one of these dogs into a panic attack that could take off Edmund's hand. They were broken machinery, dangerous, and unpredictable. But as Edmund sat there, listening to the heavy, rhythmic thud of the big dog lowering his 90-pound body into the deep pine shavings, he felt a strange tightening in his chest. The dog let out a long, whistling sigh that blew the dust away from the bottom of the stall door. It was the sound of a lung completely emptying. It was the sound of an animal that had finally stopped running. Edmund unscrewed his thermos again. He raised it in a silent, solitary toast toward the shadows. "Welcome home, boys," he whispered. "If this story of broken pieces finding home moved you, don't let it stop here. We all carry invisible scars, but sometimes the quietest acts of understanding can save a life. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances for our forgotten veterans, both two-legged and four-legged. Share this video to spread Edmund's raw, unspoken compassion with others. And make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deeply human stories grounded in truth. See you next time.